The woods of rural Virginia had a way of swallowing sound, as if the trees themselves were sworn to secrecy. In the year 1875, fog clung to the forest floor like a living thing, creeping between trunks and wrapping itself around the old family estate that stood miles from the nearest road. From a distance, the house appeared noble white columns, tall windows, a name carved into stone meant to endure for generations. Up close, it felt rotten, as though something inside had been decaying long before anyone noticed the smell. They were a family spoken of with respect in town, their surname carried with lowered voices and cautious admiration. Church pews made room for them. Shopkeepers nodded a little deeper. No one questioned how they lived so far from others, or why their children rarely mingled beyond the property line. Respect, after all, can be a powerful blindfold. Inside the house, a young woman stood at the top of the staircase, listening to her father's voice rise and fall below. She did not yet know what had been decided for her, only that the air felt heavier than usual, pressing against her chest with every breath. Somewhere beyond the walls, her brother paced the edge of the woods, boots sinking into damp soil, trying to outrun a dread that already knew his name. The family believed blood was sacred, pure, unbroken, worth any sacrifice. They believed a name could outlive sin if protected fiercely enough. And so, beneath the groaning beams of that old house and the watchful stillness of the forest, a decision was made that would never be written down, never spoken aloud beyond those walls. Begins quietly, the way all true disasters do, with a whisper that refuses to stay buried. For generations, the family's name had stood untouched, polished by wealth, land ownership, and carefully controlled appearances. In the tight-knit Virginia countryside of 1875, reputation was currency, and this family possessed it in abundance. But beneath the polished surface lay a fragile truth: the bloodline that defined their social standing was under threat. Old records, half-forgotten letters, and a looming legal inquiry hinted that something about the family's lineage did not align with the story they had sold to the world. What had once been dismissed as harmless rumor now carried the weight of exposure. The patriarch understood the danger immediately. In an era where honor meant survival, the revelation of illegitimacy, inheritance fraud, or moral corruption could dismantle everything in a matter of days. Land could be seized, marriages annulled, and the family reduced to a cautionary tale whispered in church aisles. Worse still, the scandal threatened to expose past sins committed by those long dead, sins that had been carefully hidden through strategic unions and selective silence. If uncovered, the truth would not only disgrace the living but unravel the authority the family had wielded for decades. The threat did not come with shouting or public accusation. It arrived in the form of a private warning, delivered through a lawyer's letter and a visit from a distant relative who asked too many questions. Each inquiry felt like a crack spreading across a dam, slow but inevitable. The family realized that once outsiders began digging into birth records and inheritance claims, the illusion of purity would collapse. The idea that the family name could be dragged into public scrutiny terrified them more than any sin itself. This moment reshaped the household entirely. Conversations grew guarded, doors closed more often, and decisions were made in hushed tones late into the night. The family no longer asked what was right or lawful, only what was necessary. Protecting the name became an obsession, eclipsing love, morality, and even basic humanity. The scandal was not yet public, but it already controlled them, dictating their movements and poisoning their thoughts. In their minds, the family name was a living thing, something that had to be fed and defended, even if it demanded a sacrifice that would haunt every generation that followed. Emerges from the mind of the patriarch, a man shaped by land, legacy, and the belief that authority flows downward like blood itself. He had inherited more than property and a surname. He had inherited the duty to protect them at any cost. To him, the family name was not simply a word spoken in town or etched into stone, but a shield that separated his lineage from ruin and insignificance. When the threat of exposure became undeniable, his thinking hardened, stripping away any lingering sentimentality. Law, faith, and conscience were luxuries for families without something to lose. He began to see the situation as a war against disgrace, one that demanded decisive action rather than hesitation. The outside world, with its courts and moral codes, was an enemy that did not understand the sacrifices required to preserve greatness. He convinced himself that what he was doing was not cruelty but necessity, a correction rather than a crime. In his mind, history favored those who acted boldly in silence, not those who clung to virtue and watched their legacy crumble. As nights passed, his resolve deepened. He reviewed every possible path: bribery, denial, relocation, but each carried the risk of discovery. Only one solution promised absolute control, one that would seal the bloodline and silence questions before they could fully form. It was an idea so disturbing that it could only be spoken in fragments, tested first in thought before being forced into reality. He did not see his children as individuals in this moment, but as extensions of the name he guarded, pieces on a board where survival justified any move. His authority within the household made resistance nearly impossible. Generations had been raised to obey without question, to accept that the patriarch's word carried the weight of divine instruction. He used that power deliberately, shaping fear into compliance, framing obedience as duty and rebellion as betrayal. The house itself seemed to bend to his will, its halls echoing with an unspoken understanding that something irreversible was coming. What made this decision truly dangerous was the calm with which it was reached. There was no sudden outburst or rage, no visible sign of madness. Instead, there was clarity, cold and unwavering. He believed that if one sin could prevent a greater disgrace, then it was not only acceptable but righteous. In choosing to sacrifice his own children's futures, he convinced himself he was preserving them in another way, sparing them from a world that would destroy them without mercy. This belief, rooted in pride and fear, became the foundation for an act that would stain the family far more deeply than any scandal they sought to prevent unfolds in the remote stretch of Virginia's forests, where isolation becomes both refuge and prison. The family estate, though grand in appearance, sat miles from the nearest road, hemmed in by towering pines and the shadow of a river that wound through the woods like a dark vein. From a distance, the property seemed a sanctuary, removed from gossiping neighbors and wandering eyes. Up close, it revealed its true nature, a labyrinth of creaking floors, hidden rooms, and overgrown paths that kept secrets as easily as the trees kept their shadows. Here, in this seclusion, decisions could be made without interference, and consequences could be postponed until they became too immense to ignore. The woods were more than scenery, they were participants, silent witnesses to the family's rising tension, their stillness amplifying the sense of inevitability. It was within these confines that the patriarch realized he could exercise complete control. The outside world, with its potential investigators, moral judges, and nosy townsfolk, would never intrude here. Every choice made in the house or its surrounding land could be executed with precision, and every act of defiance could be observed and corrected before it escaped beyond the property line. The daughter, whose life had always been circumscribed by expectations of obedience, now found herself in a house where the walls seemed to move closer each day, where the doors led only to rooms that held their own quiet terror. She could sense the weight of her family's eyes even when none were present, and the air of the estate, damp with the forest's constant breath, pressed against her with the promise of confinement. The brother, too, felt the oppressive grip of the isolation. He walked along the forest's edge, the soil soft beneath his boots, listening to sounds that were both familiar and unsettling, the rustle of leaves, the call of distant birds, the snapping of twigs that hinted at unseen movement. Each step reminded him that the forest could protect him from outsiders or trap him entirely, and he realized that the true danger lay not beyond the trees but within them, within the rules and expectations that had been drilled into him since childhood. Every plan made here, every decision executed, was hidden by the same green canopy that promised life but delivered judgment. The woods, so long a haven, now took on a darker character. The family understood that here, in this tangled world of roots and shadows, they could act with impunity. Yet that same freedom carried a silent terror, for isolation magnifies everything, and secrets left in such a place grow heavier, more alive, and impossible to ignore, waiting for the moment when they would demand release. Comes with the first sharp realization, the moment when the young woman begins to understand that her life is no longer her own. 4 years, she had lived within the walls of the estate as though the world beyond its gates did not exist, her days measured by routine and obedience rather than choice. She had been taught that family was everything, that her duty was to honor the name she carried, and that questioning the rules set before her was unthinkable. Yet in the shadowed corners of the house, where the flicker of candlelight could not chase away the chill. Fragments of conversations, furtive glances, and whispered warnings began to accumulate, like pieces of a puzzle she did not yet have the courage to complete. Slowly, she realized that decisions had been made for her, decisions that would shape her body, her future, and her very identity, without her consent or understanding. The first stirrings of fear came as subtle unease, a tightening in her chest when she overheard her father speaking with her brother in tones that carried authority beyond argument. Their words hinted at arrangements that belonged to a world of strategy rather than affection, of duty rather than love. At first, she dismissed it as exaggeration, a child's misinterpretation of adult concerns. But as days passed, the evidence became undeniable. She was no longer simply a daughter, a sister, or a girl learning her place in the world. She was a vessel for something far larger and far darker, a living instrument designed to protect a name, to satisfy a tradition that had no regard for her will. Her awareness came with a peculiar clarity. She saw her father's rigid control, the way he measured every movement, every expression, as if testing her compliance. She observed her brother's own struggle, the tension in his shoulders and the hollow look in his eyes, and understood that he, too, was trapped in the same web of duty, fear, and obedience. The house itself seemed to conspire with them, corridors narrowing, ceilings low, windows framing the forest as both prison and protector, reminding her constantly that there was nowhere to run. By the time the realization settled fully in her mind, it was too late for protest, too late for negotiation. She had crossed the invisible threshold where childhood innocence gave way to a terrifying knowledge of the power her family wielded over her. Each glance at her father revealed calculation, each word from her brother echoed compliance. The understanding came not with anger, but with a suffocating sense of inevitability, a recognition that the life she had imagined, full of choices and freedoms, had been quietly erased. In that moment, she saw the full scope of the machinery surrounding her, and the cruel logic that bound her fate to the preservation of a name that was valued above her very existence. Centers on the brother, a young man whose life had been shaped by obedience and fear long before the threat to the family name emerged. He had grown up under the same rigid rules, taught that loyalty to his father and the preservation of their legacy were the highest virtues, above compassion, love, or conscience. When the shadow of scandal crept closer, he realized with a cold clarity that the choices presented to him were not truly choices at all. Resistance carried consequences he could not bear to face: exile, shame, or perhaps even violence. The weight of the family's expectations pressed on him like the suffocating air of the estate's shadowed corridors, leaving him with no room to maneuver, no space to breathe freely, no hope that the world beyond the woods would intervene on his behalf. At first, he wrestled with denial, attempting to convince himself that the whispers of secrecy and coercion could not be true, that the father he had revered would never demand something so unnatural. But as the days passed, it became clear that he had no allies, no one to confide in, no sanctuary outside the forest's edge. Every glance from his father carried command, every whispered suggestion felt like an invisible hand guiding him toward a path he would rather not tread. Even the girl he had known his whole life, his sister, became both companion and instrument, her presence a constant reminder of the role he was expected to play in the preservation of a legacy he neither created nor wanted to sustain. The realization crystallized during moments alone in the woods, where he thought he might find solace or escape. But the forest offered no freedom, only reflection, showing him the inevitability of what was demanded. Each tree seemed to lean closer, each rustle of leaves echoing the authority that had been drilled into him from birth. The very air felt heavy with expectation, as if the estate and the surrounding land itself had been imbued with a consciousness intent on enforcing obedience. He understood that refusal was impossible without destroying not only the family name but himself, and that the price of defiance would be far greater than the burden of compliance. By the time he confronted the reality of his role, his emotions were a mixture of dread and numb resignation. He felt the ancient logic of bloodlines and honor suffocating any personal desire or moral objection. His fear was not merely of punishment but of the broader consequences: the collapse of the household, the ruination of generations, and the public disgrace that would linger like a stain on every family member. In that moment, he recognized that his loyalty, obedience, and fear were inseparable, and that the very qualities that had defined his upbringing would now force him into a role from which there was no return arrives with the act that would forever bind the family in silence and shadow, the forced marriage that transformed obedience into a living horror. It was carried out with the precision of someone accustomed to command, in a house where every creak of the floorboards and whisper of the wind seemed to conspire in secrecy. No bells rang, no neighbors gathered. The ceremony required no witnesses beyond the dim glow of lantern light and the unblinking watch of the forest outside. Within the walls, the patriarch orchestrated everything as if orchestrating a ritual, his instructions measured, his voice calm, betraying none of the moral corrosion that gnawed at the edges of his mind. The girl, barely aware of the full implications until the last moment, stood trembling, a fragile figure trapped between duty, fear, and the sudden recognition that her future had been stolen. Her brother, equally entrapped by loyalty and terror, faced the same grim reality, forced into a role for which neither heart nor soul had prepared him. The room was heavy with anticipation and the unspeakable weight of family expectation. Every movement seemed amplified, every breath measured against the invisible rules that dictated behavior in that house. The girl's hands shook as if the body itself knew the enormity of what was about to occur, and yet there was no choice, no avenue of escape. Her brother, standing beside her, carried the same unspoken despair, the internal conflict of love, fear, and obedience etched into his posture and the haunted look in his eyes. The patriarch's gaze, sharp and commanding, never wavered, confirming that resistance was not an option and that defiance would bring consequences worse than the act itself. Outside, the forest held its silence, its presence both protective and accusatory, a natural witness to a human atrocity conducted in the name of preservation. The marriage itself passed quietly, an event stripped of celebration, stripped of joy, leaving only the cold legal and social recognition the patriarch desired. Vows were whispered under candlelight, each word hollow, echoing in the corners of a house that had long held more secrets than life. No prayers or blessings from clergy, no friends or family to offer counsel, only the suffocating stillness of a world carefully insulated against scrutiny. For the girl, it marked the erasure of choice, a transformation from daughter to possession, a tool wielded in defense of a legacy that had little regard for her humanity. For the brother, it was a betrayal of everything he had known, forced into complicity with an act that violated instincts, morality, and the bond he had cherished with his sister. And yet the patriarch regarded it as necessary, a correction to a potential collapse of honor, convinced that the preservation of the family name justified the creation of a crime that would echo across generations. Emerges not from the family itself but from the quiet, watchful community that surrounded them, a community that sensed the unnatural tension within the estate but chose the easier path of silence. For years, townspeople had murmured about the family, noting the strange rhythms of their lives, the way no child ever played beyond the property line, the way visitors were rare and fleeting. Windows were drawn, shutters closed, and the air around the estate carried an almost tangible separation from the rest of the world. Rumors circulated in whispers at the general store, at the church, and along dusty roads, yet no one pressed the matter. Fear, respect, and the unspoken understanding of power kept them at bay. People recognized that some truths were better left unspoken, that curiosity carried risks that ordinary villagers were not prepared to face. The family's isolation was not just physical but social, reinforced by the tacit compliance of neighbors who preferred the appearance of normalcy over the discomfort of knowledge. When oddities arose, sudden disappearances, unexplained illnesses, or strange behavior among the siblings, they were noticed, yes, but rationalized away. A girl's withdrawn manner might be dismissed as shyness, a boy's tension as a symptom of adolescence. No one asked too many questions about late-night rituals, whispered conversations, or the air of fear that clung to the house like moss. The forest, a natural barrier, amplified the mystery, giving the impression that whatever occurred there was unreachable, untouchable, and therefore beyond interference. Outsiders sensed the weight of unspoken rules, and they obeyed them as instinctively as the family did, letting suspicion give way to avoidance. The family, aware of this quiet complicity, drew confidence from it. Their sins and manipulations could remain concealed precisely because the world around them was willing to look away. The very structure of rural society in 1875 allowed such arrangements. Reputations were fragile, gossip was dangerous, and challenging a prominent household risked social exile. This knowledge created a feedback loop. The more the community ignored, the more daring the family became, their decisions insulated by the fear and inertia of those who might have intervened. Even small acts of cruelty or coercion were carried out with impunity, their consequences softened by a world too polite, too timid, or too self-interested to intervene. Yet beneath the quiet compliance, suspicion fermented, like water trapped in a hollow log. The villagers felt the unease, the sense that something unnatural had been done, something that should not exist in the sunlight of moral order. Though they did not speak, they watched, and in their silence, they became unwilling witnesses to the machinery of coercion unfolding behind the estate's doors, aware enough to understand the stakes but powerless or unwilling to disrupt them. The family thrived on that inaction, emboldened by the community's failure to act, knowing that their secret would remain secure as long as fear and deference prevailed. Arrives in the form of murmurs and shadows that begin to slip beyond the boundaries of the estate, small disturbances that hint at the unnatural arrangements hidden behind the closed doors. Strange behavior among the children, odd absences, and the oppressive tension that clung to every family member became impossible for neighbors to ignore entirely, even if they tried. A once quiet farmhand might remark on a door left ajar at odd hours, a merchant might notice a young girl appearing pale and withdrawn at church, and whispers of unexplained pregnancies or late-night movements began to circulate, carried carefully on the lips of those too frightened to confront the family openly. These subtle signs were enough to ignite curiosity and suspicion, though no one dared demand answers, for fear of provoking wrath or scandal that might spill over onto themselves. The estate had been a fortress of secrecy for so long that even minor cracks caused the careful facade to tremble. Rumors, once confined to the private spaces of homes and church pews, began to take on a life of their own. Words, repeated and twisted by fear and imagination, created narratives that may have exceeded the truth yet captured something essential: that the family's order was unnatural, that obedience had become compulsion, and that morality had been bent to the preservation of the name. The children, taught from birth to obey, carried the visible signs of repression, their movements and expressions revealing what their words could not. Outsiders observed the tension like a slow-moving storm, recognizing that the estate's calm surface masked something violent and morally corrupt, even if they could not yet name it. Every rumor was a spark, every glance a warning, and the collective unease of the community began to stir like wind through dry leaves, brushing against the hidden horrors inside. The family responded to these stirrings with the same quiet calculation that had guided their isolation. They intensified their control over the household, restricting access to the children, supervising every interaction, and reinforcing the rituals of obedience that had already bound their lives. They relied on the inertia of fear, knowing that most people preferred to whisper rather than confront, to avoid the family rather than challenge them. And yet, despite these measures, the presence of suspicion was itself a threat, a reminder that even the most carefully orchestrated secrets are never entirely safe. The family's power depended not only on obedience but on the ignorance or willful blindness of those beyond the estate's walls. As whispers gathered strength and rumors multiplied, the house, so long a sanctuary and prison, began to feel smaller, the shadows heavier, and the inevitability of exposure edged closer, its approach silent yet undeniable. Like the slow crawl of mist through the forest at dawn. Emerges years after the initial secrecy, when the consequences of the family's actions begin to surface in ways that cannot be contained. Time, which the patriarch once believed would bury scandal like leaves in the forest, proves to be a double-edged sword. The children, shaped and constrained by forced obedience, grow into adulthood carrying the invisible scars of their upbringing, their lives marked by fear, guilt, and a sense of powerlessness. The daughter, in particular, becomes a living testament to the unnatural arrangements imposed upon her, and the consequences of her coerced marriage begin to ripple outward in ways the patriarch never anticipated. Her existence, once hidden behind the estate's walls, starts to attract attention. A midwife notices her condition, a distant relative questions the timing of births, or an official stumbles upon inconsistencies in family records. The cracks, long ignored, grow wider, threatening to expose every carefully guarded secret. The brother, too, is caught in the tension of a secret that cannot remain buried forever. He carries the weight of his complicity, the memory of every whispered word and every coerced action. What once seemed like obedience now feels like chains, and he begins to see the moral cost of his compliance in stark relief. The siblings' relationships, already complicated by fear and coercion, begin to unravel as their private suffering collides with the outside world's probing questions. Their lives, meticulously planned to preserve a name, now carry the seeds of discovery, and every interaction with outsiders becomes a potential trigger for the collapse of the family's facade. Outside the estate, the community begins to piece together fragments of the truth. Even the most cautious villagers notice patterns: pregnancies too young, disappearances too frequent, behavior too controlled to be natural. Whispers that were once dismissed as superstition or gossip gain credibility as small, undeniable facts emerge. The family's attempts to suppress knowledge begin to fail, and the estate, once a place of calculated authority, becomes a pressure cooker of secrets threatening to erupt. The patriarch, who believed time and isolation would protect the family name indefinitely, begins to confront the reality he sought to avoid. The very tools he used to preserve reputation, obedience, secrecy, fear, now expose him to danger. Legal challenges, moral outrage, and the persistent curiosity of those beyond the forest's edge create a sense of inevitability, a creeping awareness that the sins of the past cannot remain hidden forever. In this way, the hidden consequences begin to assert themselves, subtle at first, then increasingly impossible to ignore, and the family is forced to reckon with the fact that their carefully constructed world, built on coercion and fear, may be unraveling in ways that no control, no manipulation, and no obedience can prevent. Comes with the realization that the forest itself, which had long served as a silent guardian of the family's secrets, is now the ultimate keeper of a truth that refuses to stay buried. For decades, the trees and shadows had concealed whispers, muffled cries, and the unspoken agreements that bound the household together in fear and obedience. The dense canopy, the winding paths, and the thick underbrush had created a natural barrier between the estate and the outside world, allowing the family to maintain appearances while their private horrors went unnoticed. But time has a way of bending even the strongest of veils, and the forest, though patient, is not passive. It records, remembers, and witnesses, and in its quiet, unchanging presence, it begins to hold the accumulated weight of every misdeed, every betrayal, every coerced choice, and every life altered in the name of preservation. The estate itself, framed by the towering pines and shrouded in mist, becomes a monument to both secrecy and the inevitability of revelation. The very isolation that once offered protection now seems to amplify the tension, creating a sense of inescapable exposure. The daughter, now fully aware of the consequences of her coerced marriage, understands that the woods have been silent not out of complicity but because they have always been patient, waiting for the moment when the truth demands acknowledgement. Her brother, burdened with guilt and fear, recognizes the same reality: their choices, the patriarch's authority, and the family's obsessive preservation of the name are all inscribed in the shadows, in the soil, and in the unyielding watchfulness of the forest. Even the townspeople, distant yet attentive, begin to sense that the estate is more than just a house. It is a place marked by history and secrecy, where human morality has been bent to preserve appearances. The forest acts as both witness and silent narrator, its presence hinting at stories that cannot be fully spoken aloud, yet whose echoes are felt in the way the children behave, in the strange absences, and in the unnatural tension that lingers like fog along the estate's edge. The woods have absorbed the moral corruption, the fear, and the quiet suffering, storing it as though it were a living entity, ready to reveal itself when the right moment arrives. In the end, the forest does not forget. It becomes the final authority, a repository of the family's sins and secrets, ensuring that even if human memory fails, even if the estate itself falls to ruin, the truth will persist. The silence of the trees, once a comfort to those who sought to hide, transforms into a haunting reminder that the past cannot remain buried, that every coerced decision, every act of fear, and every hidden crime leaves a trace that the natural world, patient and enduring, will hold on to indefinitely. It is in this quiet, eternal witness that the family's legacy is both preserved and condemned, and the woods, indifferent yet knowing, keep their vigil for all who dare to uncover the truth.